Greetings everybody and welcome to one of our Flowgear bite-sized videos, the purpose of which is to get you, the integrator, up to speed with some of the very important features and concepts within the Flowgear platform. And on top of that, we'll be looking at one of our very common use cases. The very first thing we're going to want to do is to log into our Flowgear tenant. Now we will have provided you with a Flowgear tenant ID. You can see I've plugged mine in on the top here, and then you'll obviously provide the user against which you would like to authenticate. Once that's been done, you can go ahead and click on Next, and that's going to log you into the Flowgear console. Now, based on the user you provided, your role will determine what you can and can't do. So through role-based access, effectively, you'll be able to navigate to certain portions of the Flowgear console. Now, ultimately, each of these Flowgear tenants is deployed against its own VM, which is going to provide you with a maximum level of separation and security. Now, the primary purpose of the console is to provide you, the user, with a space in which you can seamlessly transition to the different elements of the platform that you may find yourself working with. How this is functionally done is through selecting any of the navigational elements of on the navigation bar on the left-hand side. Let's start at the bottom, and we can go through a handful of these. Starting with drop points. Drop points are a lightweight agent that you can install on-prem, which is going to facilitate a persistent outbound connection to the primary Flowgear environment. What this functionally means is, irrespective of where your primary Flowgear environment is hosted, you're going to be able to install this tool directly on another on-prem system and still be able to get data to and from your Flowgear environment and the system in which you've installed the tool against. Connections are a place to plug in credentials unique to a particular platform or product. So if we open up one of our connections, just as an example, Salesforce, you'll notice that we can plug in credentials that would serve to authenticate you with Salesforce. And we'll be specific around what we require within the naming of the particular properties. And you can also take a look at our help article, which is going to give you an idea of what each one does and how you could potentially acquire it. Now, you can effectively go and test against that as well using the test connection button. There we go. You will then note that you have in fact been able to connect to that environment. You'll also see that you can go and click on different environments here. Test UAT in production. Functionally, this allows you to plug in different sets of credentials for the different environments you may own or have access to. Now, you can customize this. You can have additional environments. You can change their names. You can remove some. Ultimately, we're not always aware of what your environment looks like in terms of lifecycle management, so you get to set it up according to what your current policy or procedure has been up until this point. It also plays a large role in how we do lifecycle management in general within Flowgear, and we'll get to that a bit later as well. Now let's take a look at workflow logs. This is a place in which we are able to store the transactional inputs and outputs of all the nodes that have executed within the platform. And you can see what those inputs and outputs are here. You can also redact that as well. So anything you do not want to be stored can be redacted and therefore will never be stored on the Flowgear platform. And functionally what this place does is it allows developers or anybody developing or maintaining these solutions to have a very good view of what has happened on the platform so that they could potentially debug and solve a problem should one arise. It's not going to fill the purpose of reporting to your end users or integration reporting in general. Those kinds of tasks whereby, as an example, you want to report a number of invoices processed, which of them failed and why they failed, that would be something that is built alongside the workflows themselves. Finally, we can take a look at workflows. Workflows are the design canvases on which we actually build these solutions. So here's where we then facilitate that drag and drop and low to no code design. And we're going to go ahead and open one up and give you a bit more detail around what that looks like. Let's go ahead and open up a brand new workflow. You can go ahead and do this by clicking on the new workflow button over here. We'll then have a randomly generated name, which of course you're welcome to change. And we can go ahead and confirm that on the bottom right. We're then greeted with a Flowgear design canvas, the primary purpose of which is to expose all of Flowgear's pre-built tooling so that you, the integrator, can drag and drop that onto the canvas and then build some kind of integration or automation, really to whatever level of complexity you require. Now, as I've said, there's a big emphasis on drag and drop, and there's an emphasis on low to no code based on your preference and the kind of tools you'd like to use. Now, how we can expose these tools to the canvas is by clicking on any of the plus icons you see popping up as I hover around. And we're then going to be greeted with these tools as a list of nodes. We call them nodes. They're best described as elements that can be dropped onto the design canvas that will then provide a particular integration process. So in other words, they're going to be doing something for you. Now, depending on what they're doing for you, we'll have them categorized into one of 4 distinct categories. The very first category is our connectors. They will effectively connect to the systems that we want to integrate and automate, and they do this by exposing as much of that vendor's API functionality as is possible, and exposing those actions at something called samples. That might not make a lot of sense right now, but you'll see exactly what that looks like a little bit later. We then have triggers. Triggers will determine the condition upon which a workflow executes. So in other words, it allows you to determine whether your workflow should execute once daily, based off of an email arriving in an inbox, a particular queue. There are a number of mechanisms to determine whether your workflow should kick off. Processes are going to work with data in memory with the intent to transform that data and prepare it for the next stage, whether that's one of many or the final stage of ingress. Effectively, what these nodes will do is ensure that you can enrich, supplement, transform, and validate the data to get it into the systems that you're actually attempting to integrate with. And finally, flow control gives you the ability to enable conditional branching on the canvas, and that conditional branching will form the high-level logic for things like error handling, business logic, any kind of decision making that the workflow has to actually make, even if that data has to be handled by a separate workflow or anything of that sort. Now, ultimately, it's a collection of all of these nodes that allow you to build these integrations to whatever level of complexity you require. Triggers are then going to facilitate the condition upon which the workflow executes. So it will determine whether your workflow should kick off twice daily, once an email arrives in a particular inbox, monitor a particular queue. There's a number of options for why a workflow would or wouldn't kick off. We then have processes, the primary purpose of which is to go ahead and work with the extracted data in memory with the intent to transform that data and prep it for the next step, whether that is one of many steps or the final step of ingress. Functionally, they will go ahead and transform, enrich, validate, and supplement those data sets so that you can move them across to the systems you want them to be in. Finally, we have flow control. Flow control nodes will allow you to enable conditional branching on the canvas, which forms a big portion of your high-level logic or decision making. This could be error handling. This could be determining whether a particular process has to be kicked off by a sub-workflow, whether an invoice has to be processed with a different kind of mapping. It is once again going to allow you to make a lot of the decisions that make up your production-ready workflow. It is, of course, a collection of all of these different categories that allow you to build these integrations and automations to whatever level of complexity you require. Enterprise API gives you the ability to turn any workflow into an API-bound endpoint. This means that through the typical design experience within Flowgear, you can go ahead and expose some of that functionality or data to a web endpoint, which can then be consumed by a third-party application or program that has the ability to do so. So here, in a very brief example, we're extracting information from SQL, we're mapping that into a JSON payload, and we're functionally exposing that to an endpoint that somebody can consume. And we can see how this is done by heading over to Settings, Workflow Settings, and we'll notice that we've applied a get binding to this workflow. We have our demo domain, of course, which should be customizable according to your tenant, and then we have the actual URL for test contacts. And should somebody have this URL and the appropriate access token, they can go ahead and extract a list of contacts from the database that we've hooked up within Flowgear. Revision management is a feature which allows you to inspect the design of a previous version of a workflow. You can do so by clicking on the revision history button over here. And then you can take a look at the different versions that had been saved in the past and open up any one of them. That provides you with the design of that workflow at the time that it was saved. You can then even revert to that version as the latest version by saving over the workflow, and you'll be expected to ensure that you are happy to do so by confirming with a yes for confirmation. Revision management is one of the many tools Flowgear exposes as part of our lifecycle management suite. Release management is another powerful feature within Flowgear's suite of lifecycle management tools. Release management works by preventing workflow design changes from immediately affecting production. This is done by enforcing the process of a user with the appropriate permissions promoting workflow design across the relevant environments until it is ready to be promoted into production. Let's take a look at how this is actually performed. So here we have a workflow which we're going to go ahead and save. We can provide a save or commit message over here. And then we'll receive confirmation of the workflow being saved through the green banner. At which point we can go ahead and open up the release management by clicking on this button over here. We will notice that this particular workflow has a version in test, but none in UAT or production yet. And so what we can do at this point is we can actually promote the workflow across to UAT. This will then allow us to execute the workflow in the UAT environment using the credentials that were provided in the connection under the UAT tab. And then once we're happy with that, we can go ahead and do the final portion by promoting this into production. Similarly to what I've just done. Now you're welcome to use the UI that Flowgear exposes to do this, but realistically what's happening in the back end is these particular designs are going to be stored as GitHub commits. And so you can actually see a text-based version of the workflow, which you can then compare against older versions. So while you're welcome to use it in the manner that I've just shown you, ideally you're able to forklift whatever your lifecycle management policy and procedure is into something like a GitHub environment and effectively run your pipelines and your commits and approvals as you've been doing up until now. What we'll be looking to show you with respect to this particular demo is the movement of information from SQL Server to Microsoft Excel within the scope of scheduled reporting. So a bit of background, of course, you may need to retrieve information from any one of your systems and get that information into a more readable format, which can then be sent to somebody to view twice daily, every second day, whatever the case might be. Within the scope of this one, we'll be looking at data coming out of SQL Server in the shape of stock on order, so things that have been placed on order effectively or sitting on lines within sales orders, and then move that across to Excel. The particular database we're actually retrieving this from is a Syspro database, but of course there really is mostly an emphasis on SQL Server and Excel being the two connectors we're going to use here. So let's go ahead and explore what this integration is actually going to do for us. As I previously described, we'll be getting some information from SQL and passing it along to Excel. Within the scope of what you're seeing here, this is meant to be a little bit more production ready, or meant to represent something a little bit more production ready. And so we have additional components within the space, namely the ability to determine if any data was in fact fetched. So it's a bit of error handling, if you will, or logic. And then we can again see at the end here, we're emailing that to a particular person, which in this case is myself. And so let's go ahead and execute this. The activity log will pop up at the bottom and show us exactly what's happening. Of course, the result of that query would be the raw data, which in this case is simply a list of lines on sales orders, which we're then going to use a quick map to actually tally up the quantities or sum of all of those orders against each stock code and then emailed to myself. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. We have that email open right here. For all purposes of the demo, it's been kept fairly simple. A very simple message of please find attached. And of course, you can specify the structure of the message as well as the subject and whatever you'd like to. Once again, we've kept this simple for ourselves. But if you open up this Excel report, we can actually see in our trial environment, we've got 3 stock codes, and that's the number of quantity on order for all of those stock codes. Nothing revolutionary. We don't have a lot of complex stuff going on in a sandbox environment, of course. But that's the purpose of this. So let's go ahead and take a look at what it took to build some of this out. As always, we'll kick this off with a blank canvas. And the first thing we're going to do is go to our list of nodes so that we can pick and apply the appropriate nodes onto the canvas. Now, the core of this integration involves SQL and Excel. Although I showed you some of the other components involved, we want to focus on that core, which is almost always extract, transform, and load, right? So let's take a look at what that would look like as we get the appropriate nodes on the canvas, starting with, of course, our SQL, which we have many connectors for, but we want to work with Microsoft SQL Query. We then want to apply quick map onto the canvas, which will go ahead and actually transform that data. And then we will go ahead and apply our Excel node. Now, within the scope of SQL, we want to go ahead and get a sample of the data we're working with. And so we can do this by writing a sample query and then actually executing that query. Now, I'm simply going to go and get the connection set up first and foremost, of course. We'll pick our Syspro DB. And then as we select on the query, we can see that it's actually highlighting all the different tables we have available to us. Now, we're going to get information from SOAR details, so we're simply going to do is select top 10 all from SOAR detail, just so we can get some sample information that we can actually work with. And you can see unique sales order lines here with the quantity that's actually been applied to that particular line. Of course, in a production-ready environment, you're going to want to make this a little more complex in that you'll probably fetch information that is dated past a certain date or something of the sort, but we want a sample to actually work with. We can actually execute this in isolation by clicking options, run this node, and we can then get an example of that data here, which we can then actually set against the node and make that available to our quick map. Within Excel, there is no connection, although you can apply one if you want to read a template or work with macros, but ultimately we don't need to set a connection. All we have to do is set up the fact that the result of that should go into our Excel document. And of course, we're going to do an action of type create. We'll keep it as all text for now, and we do have headers. Now, within the scope of Excel, there's no samples for this, as you need to determine what the actual field names would be that you want to send the data into. And so you can customize that by just providing a JSON or XML payload based on what you're looking for. I'm simply going to paste the payload that I've set up into my quick map. You can see it's simply a payload with a number of columns for stock, or rows rather, sorry. And then there's a column for stock code and total on order. Nothing too crazy. At this point, we can actually head over to the mapping phase, which is done by clicking on Change View. And here we'll actually see a data tree, left-hand side and right-hand side. Left-hand side represents what's coming from the SQL environment. Right-hand side is, of course, what's expected to go into Excel. And primarily what this tool will then seek to do is make this structural portion of the mapping as easy as possible by allowing you to drag and drop structures and fields. So to start this off, each table, which is effectively representing a row in the case of the Syspro extract, needs to be one stock code or one record effectively within the stock. We'll go ahead and apply the stock code into the stock code section, and then we can go ahead and provide the order quantity as the total on order. Now what this does is it provides us with a preview of the data on the right hand side, and it'll tell us that we have got the data in the shape that is expected by Excel, or rather by us in this case. Now, of course, the intent is to sum up the number on order for each stock code. So what we've done is with our filter expressions, which you're welcome to click on here to see a list of all of our functions, you can further enrich and supplement that data. And so that can be anything from using functions like sum, count, lookup, if statements, string and math operations. That will allow you to take that data to a next level of complexity, cleanliness, whatever you have to do there effectively. Now for us, we want to do two things. We want to go ahead and key on stock code by setting that. We may get a complaint here because we are going to effectively key on something. There we go, perfect. So now we see how each stock code has got its own row effectively, but we have total on order repetition for each of the events of that particular quantity. So what we want to do then is do a sum on that list by using one of the functions we have, and you can see IntelliSense pop up and show us how this needs to look. Close that off, and then we actually have a total of 18 for that particular BIC001 stock code. This is really all we're looking to do in this case, but of course for a more complex report you can add as many columns as you want, and you continue doing any kinds of transformations that you want. But we can go ahead and close this off. At that point we can go ahead and hook up the execution flow from point to point. And what we'll do just to view this file is we'll go ahead and place a variable bar on the canvas. We'll make that variable bar of type input. Let's call it file. Select type file, XLSX, and we can then loop the table XML. Sorry, I actually messed this up. We want to make sure table XML goes into there and Excel document goes into there. So just take note of that. We can then effectively go and execute this particular portion of this workflow. We can see it ran successfully, and again the activity log popped up, and we can head over to the top here to see that particular download file, whereas previously the more complete version we had emailed it. Here we can simply download it. We'll go ahead and save it, and we can open it up and see what that looks like. Here we can see a subset of the data we saw previously because we had limited the amount of rows, of course, but it's exactly effectively what I showed you previously. Now, heading back to that design that we had, we can see, of course, that the file was downloadable, as I showed you. And if you wanted to test with more data and then download the file again, you could simply go ahead and open up your query. And this time we could even just remove this to not say top 10. We can select all of them and effectively build up this query to as complex as you need it to at the end of the day, right? So we can go ahead and close this off. That's the representation of the most basic elements of this integration. Let's head back to the complete version. And here we can see some of the other things we've done. So once again, I manipulated this query a little bit so that we get all the data coming from the environment. That's why you saw 3 different stock codes on the initial execution. We've got a week scheduler, which when you hook this up, effectively this can determine how often this runs. So this is part of our triggers. I have every weekday effectively, every 4 hours starting at 8, ending at 5 o'clock is what we've done here. But you can apply whatever kind of trigger you want. We have an if statement to determine if any rows were even returned, as if there was nothing returned, because in production, of course, you're going to target a certain set of data based off a potentially a date field or something. Then we don't have to worry about processing it if nothing was there. And then again, we pass to Excel, and then we send it through via email. So we showed you, of course, in depth around some of the core elements, such as extract, transform, and load. And then here's some of the supporting elements that might make this a little bit more production ready. Now, ultimately, with such a use case, you're mostly going to focus on the kind of data you want to extract and how you want to transform it. There isn't such a massive emphasis on error handling or similar processes that you would a traditional use case where you may be moving data across into another system. But at the end of the day, any kind of complexity you need to introduce or solve for in your solution, you can find by taking a look at the rest of the tools we have on the canvas. If you're interested in exploring some of the concepts and features that I've just shown you in more depth, you're welcome to head over to help.flowgear.net, where you'll find a list of comprehensive articles giving you more detail on some of the things that I've shown you today. On top of that, you're welcome to sign up for a free trial and explore Flowgear at your own pace. We do have a certification course available that'll take you through some of the foundational elements of Flowgear. And then finally, if you'd like, you're welcome to reach out to our team and inquire about a complimentary proof of concept where we can go ahead and show you some of what you're looking to achieve as part of the POC process.